In 1719, a Scottish banker convinced half of Paris to buy property in a land none of them had ever seen, a continent called Louisiana. He showed them maps of prosperous cities, fertile plantations, and gold mines. He described perfect climate, friendly natives, and limitless opportunity. His name was John Law, and almost everything he told them was a lie. The cities didn't exist. The plantations were impossible. The gold was fantasy. Louisiana wasn't a paradise waiting to be claimed. It was thousands of miles of swamp, jungle, and disease. But the investors couldn't verify this. Louisiana was months away by ship. No one in Paris had been there. No one could check if Law's maps were accurate. So they bought anyway, shares in the Mississippi Company that promised land ownership in America. Law sold an entire continent, piece by piece, to people who believed maps and promises. He raised hundreds of millions of livres. He created millionaires overnight. He turned Louisiana, a colonial failure that France had ignored for decades, into the most valuable real estate in the world. Then the colonists arrived, and they discovered what Louisiana actually was: a green hell where dreams went to perish. When the truth reached Paris, the entire scheme collapsed. But Law had already accomplished something unprecedented. He'd proven that you can sell what doesn't exist, as long as it's far enough away that no one can see it. This is the story of the greatest real estate fraud in history, and the man who sold a continent that nobody had seen.
You opened a door, and what lies within changed history forever. Welcome to Gains and Lore. Knowledge has a price. Are you ready?
Before Louisiana, real estate speculation required actual land. You bought property you could visit, inspect, verify. The value was tied to something tangible: soil quality, location, existing structures. John Law changed that calculation entirely. He proved that real estate's value isn't determined by what exists now, but by what people believe could exist later. And if the property is far enough away, belief can be manufactured through maps, illustrations, and promises. If you're seeing how one man turned distance into the ultimate sales advantage, hit that like button. And if you want to follow the complete story of how speculation divorced from reality, help us reach 1,000 subscribers. We're revealing the original blueprint for selling what doesn't exist. By 1717, John Law had already revolutionized French finance through his Banque Générale and paper currency system. But he needed assets to back the expanding money supply. Real assets, productive assets, assets that could justify the paper wealth flooding Paris. This was what Law simply called the system, or le système, a term that would soon make every heart in Paris race with greed. France had exactly what he needed: Louisiana, a massive territory in North America that stretched from the Gulf of Mexico to Canada. France had claimed it in 1682, but never successfully colonized it. A few scattered forts, a handful of struggling settlements. Mostly, it was wilderness that cost France money to maintain. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there. Law's technique of selling distant property, based on maps and promises, is still used in real estate speculation worldwide. Let's explore how a banker turned a colonial failure into the most profitable fraud of the 18th century. Louisiana in 1717 was a disaster. France had claimed the territory 35 years earlier, when Honoré Cavalier, Sieur de la Salle, explored the Mississippi River and declared everything it touched to be property of King Louis XIV. On paper, this was magnificent, a territory larger than all of France, stretching from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, potentially containing untold wealth. In reality, it was a swamp that killed French colonists faster than they could be sent. The climate was brutal. French settlers, accustomed to temperate European weather, arrived in Louisiana to face suffocating humidity, hurricanes, and temperature extremes. The terrain was hostile. Much of the territory was bayou, standing water breeding disease-carrying mosquitoes. The soil that wasn't swamp was often sandy or rocky, unsuitable for European farming techniques. The native populations weren't welcoming trading partners. They'd seen what European colonization meant and resisted accordingly. French forts existed in a state of constant tension, supplied irregularly, perpetually undermanned. By 1717, Louisiana had cost France enormous sums with almost nothing to show for it. A few hundred colonists scattered across impossible distances. No profitable exports. No discovered gold or silver. No thriving plantations. The French government considered it a failed investment. Some ministers advocated abandoning it entirely. But abandonment meant admitting defeat and ceding territory to Britain or Spain. Louisiana was a problem with no solution. Then John Law proposed, taking it off the government's hands. In August 1717, Law's Mississippi Company, officially the Compagnie d'Occident, was granted a monopoly trading rights to Louisiana. The company would take over all French colonial operations in North America. In exchange, Law would finance colonization, develop trade, and, crucially, pay the French government for privilege. For the government, it was perfect. Someone else would fund Louisiana's money-losing operations. And if Law succeeded, France would benefit from colonial development without direct cost. For Law, it was also perfect, because he wasn't planning to succeed at colonization. He was planning to succeed at speculation. Law understood something fundamental. Louisiana's actual value didn't matter. What mattered was its perceived value. And perception could be shaped, especially when the asset being sold was thousands of miles away, accessible only after months of dangerous ocean voyage, in a land where information traveled slowly and unreliably. Law didn't need to make Louisiana profitable. He needed to make people believe it would be profitable. And for that, he needed two things: propaganda and distance. The propaganda he could create. The distance was already there. John Law launched the most sophisticated marketing campaign the world had seen. He commissioned maps of Louisiana from the finest cartographers in Paris. But these weren't accurate maps. They were aspirational maps, fantasy maps, maps showing not what existed, but what Law promised would exist. Cities appeared on these maps: New Orleans, Biloxi, Mobile, depicted as thriving European-style towns, with organized streets, substantial buildings, busy ports. In reality, these were barely established outposts. New Orleans in 1718 was a few wooden structures in a swamp, but the maps showed cathedrals, markets, fortifications. They showed civilization. Law hired artists to create promotional illustrations, showing Louisiana's supposed abundance. Paintings depicted lush plantations, with neat rows of crops, natives peacefully trading with French colonists, gold being extracted from easily accessible mines, ships loaded with valuable cargo departing for Europe. None of this was happening, but the images were beautiful, convincing, and widely distributed across Paris. Pamphlets were printed describing Louisiana's perfect climate, mild winters, pleasant summers, ideal for European agriculture. They described fertile soil that produced 3 harvests per year, rivers teeming with fish, forests full of valuable timber. The promotional materials emphasized something psychologically powerful: opportunity for those who'd missed earlier colonial ventures. Spanish colonists had gotten rich in Mexico and Peru. English settlers were profiting from Virginia tobacco. Dutch merchants dominated Asian spices. Now France, and specifically French investors, could claim their share of colonial wealth. Louisiana was presented as the last great unclaimed prize. The campaign worked because it told people what they wanted to hear. That wealth was still available, that opportunity still existed, that they weren't too late. Critically, Law controlled information flow. He hired agents to spread optimistic rumors about Louisiana. Reports of gold discoveries, false. News of successful harvests, exaggerated. Stories of colonists writing home about prosperity, invented or heavily edited. Negative information was suppressed. When letters arrived describing hardship, disease, or failure, Law's company intercepted them or ensured they didn't circulate publicly. This created an information asymmetry. Law and his inner circle knew Louisiana's real conditions. Parisian investors knew only what Law wanted them to know. The propaganda campaign culminated in Law offering something tangible to investors: shares in the Mississippi Company that represented ownership claims to Louisiana land. Buy shares, and you owned a piece of America's future prosperity. The company would develop the land, extract resources, establish trade. Shareholders would receive dividends from Louisiana's wealth. It was compelling. It was specific. And, most importantly, it was impossible to verify. Louisiana was so far away. Information traveled so slowly that by the time investors discovered reality, Law would have already sold the dream. And so he did. The Mississippi Company share frenzy began in 1719. Law had carefully orchestrated scarcity. Initial share offerings were limited, creating demand. Early investors saw immediate price increases, validating the opportunity. Word spread. Louisiana shares were making people rich. The Rue Quincampoix in Paris became the epicenter of speculative mania. Nobles, merchants, servants, even clergy crowded the street to buy and sell Mississippi shares. Prices climbed hourly. What were they actually buying? Claims on land they'd never seen, in a colony most couldn't locate on a map. Based on maps showing cities that didn't exist. Law marketed it brilliantly as geographic diversification. In Paris, land ownership was limited, expensive, controlled by old aristocratic families. But Louisiana? Louisiana was vast, unclaimed, available. A Parisian merchant could never afford an estate in France. But he could afford shares representing thousands of acres in America. He could own plantations, forests, riverfront property. The fact that these plantations were actually malarial swamps was irrelevant. They were on a map. They had value on paper. They could be sold to someone else at higher prices. Classic speculative thinking. It doesn't matter what the asset actually is, only what the next buyer will pay for it. Law created tiered offerings to capture different investor classes. Wealthy nobles could buy large share blocks, representing vast Louisiana estates. Middle-class merchants could buy smaller parcels. Even working people could buy fractional shares pooled with others. Everyone, regardless of wealth, could participate in America's colonial future. This democratization of speculation was revolutionary. Previously, colonial ventures were limited to crown-chartered monopolies or extremely wealthy investors. Law opened Louisiana to mass participation, and the masses participated enthusiastically. By mid-1719, Mississippi Company shares had risen from 500 livres to over 10,000 livres. People who bought early were now extraordinarily wealthy, on paper. And that paper wealth felt real, because they could sell shares to new investors at current prices and receive actual currency. Overnight, a new class of people emerged. They were called millionaires, a word coined right then, but in the streets of Paris, they were known as the Mississippians, people whose entire fortunes consisted of Mississippi shares. Their wealth depended entirely on the assumption that Louisiana would eventually produce value, justifying the share prices. But Louisiana wasn't producing value. Louisiana was barely surviving. The disconnect between Parisian speculation and Louisiana reality was total. In Paris, shares trading at astronomical prices, representing ownership of productive plantations, profitable trade routes, and extractable wealth. In Louisiana, a few hundred struggling colonists dying of disease, unable to grow enough food, producing no exports, costing the company money continuously. Law knew this. His reports from Louisiana were arriving. They were catastrophic. But he couldn't admit it. The entire system, his paper currency, the Banque Royale, the Mississippi Company, the speculative economy he created, all depended on Louisiana maintaining its perceived value. So he continued selling, continued promoting, continued showing maps of cities that didn't exist. And when that wasn't enough, he began sending colonists to Louisiana to try to make some of the promises real. This was when the fraud became tragedy. The colonists' law sent to Louisiana weren't volunteers seeking opportunity. Most were coerced. France's prisons were emptied and the prisoners given a choice: remain imprisoned or sail to Louisiana. But law knew a colony needed more than just labor. It needed stability. In a move of staggering desperation, he organized what became known as the Mississippi marriages. Prostitutes rounded up from the streets of Paris were forced into mass wedding ceremonies with convicts right on the docks, often still in chains. These couples, strangers to one another, were then forced aboard ships to build a civilization in a land none of them had chosen. Orphans were shipped as indentured servants. Some genuine settlers came too, families persuaded by law's propaganda, believing they'd find the paradise depicted in the promotional materials. All of them arrived to discover something very different from what they'd been promised. The ships arrived at Louisiana's ports after months at sea. Many passengers didn't survive the voyage. Disease, malnutrition, and storms claimed lives even before landfall. Those who survived disembarked to find not the organized cities shown on maps, but crude wooden structures, mud, and oppressive heat. New Orleans in 1718, 1719 was a city. It was a clearing in a swamp with a few dozen buildings, no infrastructure, and surrounded by standing water that bred mosquitoes carrying yellow fever and malaria. The colonists were given tools and told to build a civilization law had promised investors existed. The letters that made it back to France told devastating stories. Families described arriving with hope and watching it dissolve within days. The fertile soil was swamp or sandy waste. The mild climate was suffocating humidity and seasonal hurricanes. The friendly natives were understandably hostile to invaders. Food was scarce. Crops failed repeatedly. Supply ships from France arrived irregularly. Disease spread rapidly in the cramped, unsanitary settlements. Within the first year, approximately half the colonists sent to Louisiana between 1717 and 1720 had perished from disease, starvation, or conflict. These weren't numbers in a ledger. They were people, families who believed law's promises, individuals who'd seen the maps and imagined futures that Louisiana couldn't provide. Law's company tried to suppress the negative reports. Letters were intercepted. Returning sailors were sometimes paid to not discuss conditions. The few accurate descriptions that circulated in Paris were dismissed as exaggerations from people who'd failed at colonization, not problems with Louisiana itself, but problems with weak colonists. But information, like water, finds ways through barriers. By late 1719, enough truth had reached Paris that some investors began questioning whether Louisiana was actually the paradise Law had sold them. Law responded by doubling down on propaganda. More promotional pamphlets. More optimistic maps. More promises that the difficulties were temporary, that success was imminent, that Louisiana would soon validate all the investment. He also tried to make the fantasy real through sheer will and capital. More colonists were sent, now increasingly by force, as volunteers had dried up. More supplies were shipped. More ambitious plans were announced. But you can't create gold where none exists. You can't make swampland fertile by declaring it so. You can't change Louisiana's climate or geography through marketing. Reality was arriving in Paris. And reality didn't match the maps. The collision was inevitable. The Mississippi bubble collapsed in 1720 for many reasons, but one critical factor was a growing awareness that Louisiana, the supposed source of all future wealth, was producing nothing. No gold had been discovered. No profitable plantations had been established. No valuable exports were flowing back to France. The territory was consuming capital, not generating it. Investors who bought shares based on Law's maps began realizing they'd purchased claims on land that couldn't deliver the promised returns. When doubt entered the market, the speculative logic reversed instantly. If Mississippi shares were worth 10,000 livres because Louisiana would eventually be profitable, what were they worth if Louisiana would never be profitable? Suddenly, everyone wanted to sell. No one wanted to buy. Prices collapsed. From 10,000 livres to 5,000, then 2,000, then back below the original 500 livre price. Within months, the paper fortunes that had made thousands of Parisians into millionaires evaporated. John Law fled France in December 1720, disguised and disgraced. He'd promised to transform Louisiana into France's greatest colonial asset. Instead, he'd sold a fantasy that thousands of people had paid for, and hundreds had gone to America chasing. The colonists who'd gone to Louisiana based on his propaganda were largely abandoned. Some eventually carved out survival in the harsh environment. Many didn't. The investors who bought shares based on his maps lost fortunes. Some had mortgaged everything to buy into the scheme. But Law had accomplished something that would outlast his personal failure. He'd proven that distance is the ultimate enabler of fraud. When a thing being sold is far enough away that buyers can't verify its condition, reality becomes negotiable. You can sell maps instead of land, promises instead of results, future potential instead of present facts. This insight didn't disappear with Law's exile. It evolved. Every real estate bubble since has incorporated elements of Law's technique. Sell before building, promise before delivering, show illustrations of what could be rather than what is. The irony is that Louisiana eventually did become valuable, not in Law's lifetime, and not in the way he'd promised. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803, when France sold the territory to the United States for $15 million, proved the land had worth, just not the worth Law had claimed in 1719. By the time Louisiana's actual resources were developed, agriculture, oil, strategic positioning, the people who believed Law's maps were long gone. Their investments had vanished. Their dreams had perished in the swamps. But the land remained, and eventually, reality caught up to the propaganda. just a century too late for the people who bought the fantasy. John Law passed away in 1729 in Venice, still believing his system had been sound and that only the execution had failed. He never acknowledged that selling Louisiana as a paradise when he knew it was agreeing hell was fraud. He saw it as optimistic marketing, as selling potential, as believing in a future that could exist if only enough capital and colonists were directed there. This self-deception is common among those who sell what doesn't exist. They convince themselves that the gap between promise and reality is just timing, that eventually the future will validate the maps. Sometimes it does. Usually, it doesn't. And in the meantime, people pay for dreams with real money. And sometimes with their lives. John Law sold an entire continent based on maps showing cities that didn't exist, mines that were never found, and plantations that couldn't survive. Thousands of Parisians bought shares believing they owned pieces of America's future. Hundreds of colonists sailed to Louisiana, believing they'd find the paradise Law had described. Both groups discovered that distance is the ultimate deception. When the truth is months away by ship, lies can flourish for years. The Mississippi bubble collapsed in 1720, but the technique survived. Selling what doesn't exist, as long as it's far enough away that no one can check. Every real estate bubble since has used Law's playbook. Show the map, not the land. Sell the future, not the present. Make sure the buyer can't verify until after they've bought. Louisiana eventually became valuable, just not for people who believed Law's maps. They paid real money for fantasy and learned that propaganda expires when it meets reality. If you're starting to see why location matters less than information, subscribe for the rest of the series. Like this if you'd never heard how John Law sold an entire continent that nobody had seen. Comment whether modern real estate speculation is fundamentally different from Law's Louisiana scheme, or just the same game with better maps. Share this with someone who buys property based on developer renderings. They're trusting the same technique Law used 300 years ago. The archive grows. The patterns repeat. The maps keep lying. John Law proved that you can sell what doesn't exist, as long as it's far enough away that reality arrives too late.